In today's episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about a poem by W.S. Merwin, someone who I've considered for a long time one of our national treasures, whose work I fell in love with when I was in high school, reading poems of his in publications like The Atlantic or Harper's. And I've had the very good fortune of being able to hear him read many times and to talk with him on several occasions. One of the things that I remember that most touched me about one of our conversations was he had these dogs in Hawaii that he really loved, and his interactions with them make up a part of The Shadow of Sirius, which is the volume of poems that I'm going to be referencing today. And he said, there's so much that you can learn about the way you are with animals, or from interacting with animals, not just humans. And I just thought that was really beautiful to think about. So I know a lot of you already know of Merwin's poems, or I think probably you will. When I talk about Merwin with students, one of the things that we end up really focusing on is the effect of so many of his poems, especially from the last few decades, is this feeling of floating and almost suspension. Even though they're very grounded, there's a lot of earth in them, the experience is as though it's kind of rising above the earth somehow. And so the question is, what can we see when we look at his work on the page or think about it? How does he do this? How does he manage to create this effect that feels so mysterious and a little bit mystical? And there are a few things that I've thought a lot about that you can see how he's doing on the page that I wanted to talk about today. The first one, which is the most obvious to people who are encountering his work of the last few decades for the first time, is his real skill in managing to deploy a poem with almost no punctuation. It's rare to find a piece of punctuation in his poems, and yet somehow the poems still manage to proceed in a way that makes sense. And I think it's a very hard thing to do. A lot of times when people first come to poetry, they think maybe a poem doesn't have punctuation, perhaps because of the effect of enjambment, when a sentence continues from one line into the next. So it's not that you're going to have an end stop every single line or a period every single line. But I think it's actually really difficult to do well. And he's a master of it. So that's one of the qualities that pulls us into something that feels like an unusual territory when we're encountering his work. Another thing is what I think of as the spirit of parataxis. This is a little bit more technical, and it might not be something that is as visible at first. Parataxis and hypotaxis are two ways to talk about the way when you're putting together a sentence or a compound sentence or a sentence with numerous clauses and phrases, you may coordinate them with conjunctions of some kind. And especially when you get into conjunctions like when, since, because, if you're creating a sentence with more hierarchy, maybe displaying more cause and effect, but if the connective tissue in there is leading the reader to sort of a single conclusion about how to organize the arrangement of all the phrases because of the conjunctions that are used, especially if they're what we call subjugating, you're in the realm of what we call hypotaxis. But if there's a feeling that instead of that, the phrases or the things seen are side by side by side by side, and there's, if you want to think of it this way, a more democratic lens being the thing through which we see all this phenomena, then you're more in the realm of parataxis. And I think the absolute exact definition of parataxis leads us to think that there should be no conjunctions whatsoever between these fragments or phrases or objects. You can do that with short sentences or semicolons, but I like to think about the spirit of parataxis, where we allow a little bit of connective tissue in there, particularly with the word and, where there's a feeling of, it's almost like a pan shot, like you're panning, if this is a film, looking from one thing to another, to another, to another, and maybe even in different locations or different times. And this is something that Merwin does more frequently. And before we listen to a poem of his that's displaying some of these qualities, as well as another one I'll talk about soon, I want to go to Hemingway, because even in prose, and sometimes maybe even more clearly in prose, if this is really going on, we can see it. I just want to read you 2 sentences from Hemingway's A Movable Feast. You could almost choose them at random, but these happen to be from the opening page. And you can hear how he's doing this and how he's doing it with the conjunction and, where there's not moment by moment feeling of hierarchy in the way these things are arranged, but it's as though he's panning among these phenomena. We would have to shut the windows in the night against the rain, and the cold wind would strip the leaves from the trees in the Place Contrescarpe. The leaves lay sodden in the rain, and the wind drove the rain against the big green autobus at the terminal, and the Café des Amateurs was crowded, and the windows misted over from the heat and smoke inside. So in prose, with this horizontal feeling stretch of phenomena, we get this feeling of somebody who's just looking at or thinking about these things moment by moment by moment, side by side by side. You'll see how Merwin is doing this in a poem that I'm going to read of his called Accompaniment from the Shadow of Sirius. But before I do this, there's one more thing that I want to pop into your minds before you hear the poem, and we can look at it a little bit. And that is the way he uses, almost line by line by line, what we call the turn in a poem. If you think about a sonnet and you're thinking about where the sonnet turns, if you're thinking of a British sonnet, it's 14 lines. Maybe there's an A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G rhyme formation. And one of the features of the sonnet that is often definitive is in the British sonnet, once you get to the last 2 lines, the heroic couplet, there's the volta, which is a big turn, as though you're walking through a field and you run into a fence and you can't go any further. So you have to turn. A lot of times in a Shakespearean sonnet, there's been an argument that you're following with a series of examples that then turns at the end. So you feel kind of spun around. It's like a hairpin turn. An Italian sonnet or a Petrarchan sonnet has a gentler feeling turn that's usually about 2/3 the way through. So it's not like you're veering as much. The word verse, if you look at the French etymology of it, the origin of the word has to do with this feeling of turning or overturning or spilling, almost like you're flipping things over. And I've seen a few poets do this really, really well, even within the context of free verse, where they're not paying attention to things like rhyme, for instance. One of them is also Linda Hull, who I want to recommend to anybody who doesn't know her work. But just listen to this poem, Accompaniment, by W.S. Merwin. And we'll also be showing this so that you can view it. But I'll try to read it fairly naturally, but at times I may slightly pause a little bit more than I normally would from line by line, so that you can really get a feeling for how surprising these lines are the first time you hear or read the poem. Accompaniment. The wall in front of me is all one black mirror in which I see my hands washing themselves all by themselves, knowing what they are doing as though they belong to someone I do not see there and have never seen, who must be older than I am, since he knows what he is doing above the basin of bright metal in the black wall where the water looks still as a frozen lake at night, though the bright ripples on it are trembling under me. The floor and my feet on it are trembling. It is late. It was late when we started. Over my shoulder, my mother's voice is telling me what we do next on the way and how the train is made that is taking us away. And in a while, I will be asleep and I will wake up far away. We are going south, where I know that my father is going to die, but I will grow up before he does that. The hands go on washing by themselves. Line by line by line, there are these surprises. And when I first encountered this poem, and usually when I read it, if I'm imagining the speaker, I'm imagining Merwin as a middle-aged to older person. But I realized that we don't know what the starting point is for this speaker. We know that at some point he's calling up memories from a much younger part of his experience and life. But whether or not he's imagining his way into this poem as the speaker from the point of view of a child or a very young person, or whether he's imagining it as someone who's entering it as a person, an older person, like I always imagine it as like something that could begin in a hotel with, you know, one of those big black walls and in a hotel bathroom in a mirror. And then suddenly there's this descent or return into childhood self and these earlier memories that spring up and inform the whole thing. We don't know, which is one of the other things that's so wonderful about this effect. It's hard to tell exactly at what point in life Merwin is imagining this, but one of the things that I find really moving is to imagine that, in fact, the speaker is beginning the poem as an adult, as an older adult. And still, I see my hands washing themselves all by themselves, knowing what they are doing as though they belong to someone I do not see there and have never seen, who must be older than I am, since he knows what he's doing above the basin. So there's this feeling that even as we become adults or older adults, there's all this stuff we really don't understand or know. And I think that this is also a moment where we get a feeling for another quality in Merwin's poems that I often find, which seems very much aligned with John Keats, the Romantic poet's idea of negative capability. When he was trying to understand how Shakespeare, as a writer, could possibly inhabit such different characters in his plays, he thought it must be something like this mentally. I mean, one way to begin to think about this quality is it's almost as though you can create a blank slate in your mind and then enter it. And the heart of negative capability for me that I aspire to myself as a poet is this idea that one can be according to Keats, capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And in Merwin, it's not that the poems are fact-free. You know, as we listen to that poem again, we come to understand a number of the facts that are going to come into the poem. But it's as though he's allowing himself to fall into the space from which to experience again some of these moments as though for the first time, and as though from a point of view that's, you know, less skilled in being in the world somehow than he can imagine someone being. The idea that one's hands could do what they need to do in the wash basin, as though they knew what they were doing, as an older person might, whatever age you are, is something that I just find really intriguing and compelling.